All right. Uh, Thanks for joining, guys. Today's level up is going to be on zone training. Uh, I think it's important to understand how to train your cardiovascular system and the different benefits and adaptations of training at different intensities. Um, so, yeah, a few takeaways that I'd like you to have at the end of it is a bit more of an understanding of how our energy systems work when we exercise, what happens in our body when we train at different intensities, and to develop some awareness of things to consider when doing cardio. 1 second, somebody else is here. Cool. All right. So, a little overview on kind of like what training zones are. There's different systems, different formats. Some will have 3 zones, some will have 5, 6, or 7. And sometimes they're measured using a percentage of heart rate, uh, blood lactate levels, and also a percentage of your VO2 max. What we're going to be looking at is a 5 zone, training zones, and we're going to be mainly looking at blood lactate, but kind of understanding that most people will use heart rate. Oh, someone else is here. Okay. So blood lactate will be the like defining factor of these zones, but most people will end up using like heart rate as a proxy measurement to kind of gauge which zone they're in, because doing blood lactate testing is not very practical for most people. All right, moving forwards. Cool. So a little overview on the main energy systems when we're training. We've got our aerobic energy system, which uses oxygen, and the fuels we use with that are fats and glucose. Then we have our anaerobic energy systems, which pretty much just use glucose and don't require oxygen. When you're at rest, you're just using your aerobic energy system, and you're primarily using fats. As the intensity increases, you start to use a bit more glucose, but still in your aerobic system. And at a certain intensity, you'll start using your anaerobic energy system and burning a lot of glucose. This is pretty important to kind of understand, because a byproduct of glucose metabolism is lactate. And so as you burn more and more glucose, you start producing more and more lactate. Lactate isn't just a useless byproduct, it's also a fuel that your mitochondria can use. The mitochondria being the organelle that produces energy. So lactate isn't a bad thing by itself. But at a certain point, your body will produce more lactate than it can clear, and this will cause issues with endurance training, which we'll get to later. Okay. By the way, if you have questions, try to, I guess, save them to the end, and we'll have a questions thing at the end of the spiel. Okay, so I think I'll go through like the 5 zones, give you a bit of an idea of what each zone is about and what's happening in the body, and then we'll talk about the considerations later. Zone 1 is often called the recovery zone. You could consider this anything that's just slightly above rest. It's nothing strenuous or fatiguing and has minimal like cardiovascular benefits or adaptations. You could do this all day. It's just slightly above rest. And it's still fully aerobic, and you'll just be utilizing fats as the main fuel source. And therefore, minimal lactate production, but there may be some because it's always a combination of fuels, but mainly fats. All right, moving on to zone 2. Out of curiosity, most people have the cameras on. Has everybody like heard of zone 2 lately at all? Yeah, fantastic. So zone 2 is kind of referred to as the endurance zone. It's an intensity that you could maintain for a few hours. And for some people, like professional marathon runners, they can run super fast, but they can maintain it for 4 hours or 3 hours. And therefore, they may actually still be in basically zone 2 or just pushing it a bit harder towards the end. But for someone like me, a very slow jog might be my zone 2. Whatever you can maintain for a few hours will be zone 2. It is still fully aerobic, so we haven't gone into the anaerobic system yet, but you'll be starting to utilize more glucose for fuel as fuel as well. Because you're starting to burn more glucose, you are producing more lactate, but your mitochondria eats that lactate up, turns it into energy, and the we don't see a rise in blood lactate because it's kept under control. The main adaptation of training in zone 2 is building more mitochondria and improving like the efficiency or functionality of the mitochondria. This is important because you'll be able to clear lactate at higher intensities easier. And basically, it means that you'll be able to sustain a higher intensity for longer, which basically means that your endurance running or cycling or whatever other type of long, endurance cardiovascular exercise you're doing, you'll be able to do it at great intensities for longer, which is a fantastic thing. There are other benefits, but I'll touch on them a bit later on. So that was zone 2. Coming up to zone 3. Zone 3 is called the threshold zone, and it's basically on the cusp of your ability to not quite burn lactate at the rate that you produce it. So lactate will start building up gradually in the blood. I just want to point out from 3 onwards, the difference between the zones is primarily the rate of lactate buildup. There's other things too, but that's kind of what's happening. We're utilizing more and more glucose, therefore creating more and more lactate, but the mitochondria don't have the ability to clear it all, and this causes some issues. All right, so because exercise becomes unsustainable, I kind of want to point out that's not lactate's fault. One of the other byproducts of glucose metabolism are hydrogen ions, which accumulate in the body. These hydrogen ions actually alter the pH in our body, which is something our body doesn't like to change. It's very regulated. One of the ways we neutralize the effect of the hydrogen ions is to exhale CO2. So even though when you start moving into anaerobic energy systems, which doesn't actually require oxygen for the energy production, we have to dump lots of CO2, which is still why we breathe so much at higher intensities. But it's not the lactate's fault. We stop because of the buildup of the hydrogen ions and the inability to find a pH balance. Okay. The sort of duration you might be able to, train at in zone 3 could be about 30 minutes to an hour. But again, there are many frameworks and many sort of different numbers. But that's like the intensity you're thinking of. Whatever you could do for 30 minutes straight before having to change intensity. Okay. Training at the threshold will help move your lactate threshold, but clearly zone 2 does that very well anyway. All right, zone 4. This is the VO2 max zone. Again, the intensity is higher. Think of like running or whatever activity that you could do for potentially like 3 to 8 minutes, give or take. So it's very high intensity, but you can do it for a while still. One of the benefits of training in the VO2 max zone, zone 4, is improvements in VO2 max, which I should probably explain. VO2 max is your ability to consume oxygen. Think of volume, the volume of oxygen you can take in every minute. The higher your VO2 max, the higher your sort of general fitness levels are, and it correlates really well with endurance performance as well as shorter distance cardiovascular activities. Also, when training in zone 4, again, think about sprint or doing a very fast run for 5 minutes. You're going to be improving your breathing mechanics. You'll be improving the functionality of your actual lungs, as well as the breathing muscles, diaphragm, intercostal muscles, other secondary muscles that help with inhalation and exhalation. So it's still very important to do some training in zone 4. Every zone has some different adaptations. Okay, one thing I want to mention, and this kind of starts from zone 3 onwards, is as the intensity increases, so does the stress. Stress on your body physically and also nervous system stress. Clearly, going for a 5-minute hard as you can run is very fatiguing on your nervous system. And so as you creep up the intensity, you need to be thinking about, adding recovery and managing nutrition and managing stress as best as you can. So that's zone 4. Is the speed of what I'm talking okay? Can somebody nod? Yeah, volume's okay. Yeah, cool. All right. Zone 5. This is the top zone, the most intense zone. And this is sometimes called the anaerobic zone because there's nothing aerobic about it. It's fully anaerobic and just utilizing lots of glucose. And sometimes people call it the neuromuscular zone because some of the adaptations are very neuromuscular. You can think developing speed and power within the given movement pattern that you're choosing to train. All of this is very beneficial too, depending on your goals. But it is also very, very stressful on the body and on the nervous system. And depending on your capabilities and how like prepared your body is, you could also probably say risk of injury can creep up for some people. Think 60 seconds or less for this zone 5. That's kind of it though. Zone 3 is like the lactate threshold. And yeah, the intensity just goes up, and there are some different outcomes or adaptations for training in each different zone. Those are the zones. Hopefully that makes some sense. I want to talk about zone 2 considerations, since that's one of the most sort of commonly talked about zones. Where's it gone? Okay. Zone 2 is kind of a game of volume. It does require you to spend quite a lot of time doing it. But clearly, I think the benefits are worth it. They're worth it for performance because you'll be able to sustain a higher intensity for longer. And it's also worth it for your general health. One of the benefits of increasing the amount of mitochondria you have and their efficiency, it helps with glucose uptake. So it helps us a lot with blood sugar regulation, which is very important for our health. Consistency training in zone 2 matters. I think people overlook this, especially when they refer to their watch. Like I mentioned earlier on, we generally use our heart rate as like a proxy measurement for what will be happening in our body. However, if you go past zone 2 during a zone 2 run or a bike ride or something, and you come back down into zone 2, your body isn't really back in zone 2. Your heart rate might be, but internally, it's still kind of dealing with the zone 3 things, and you're not getting the maximum benefits of that zone 2 training. So being consistently in that zone 2 is important. If you did want to add intensity to like a long run where you try to stay in zone 2, you're much better doing it at the very end, not halfway or at the start. So that's just something to consider when doing zone 2. Zone 2 is good for everyone. Like I said before, some intense exercise may not be appropriate for some people, but zone 2 is fantastic, even if somebody is either very stressed and don't sleep well, or if they carry excess body weight. Going for a long run would be really taxing on the knees. But going for a fast walk or whatever it is that keeps them in zone 2 can be very beneficial without ruining the body. And it doesn't require as much time to recover. So recovery is pretty easy with zone 2. Ideally, and again, you could probably have different rules of thumb, but I'd say ideally 3 45-minute sessions would be ideal. Having 1 or 2 would be fantastic. I would say a lengthier session is better than small sessions. I would not do 3 20-minute sessions. Ideally, I'd have like a 45-minute session and then see what else I can fit in, just as a general rule of thumb. Okay. Other considerations, almost at the end of it. Clearly, zone 2 is important. It's important for our health, and it's also important if you do actually have endurance sort of sports targets and goals. But improving VO2 max is still fantastic. Improving speed and power is fantastic. The ability to breathe and actually move your rib cage, with strength is fantastic. So training in a range of zones, I think is pretty beneficial if you have the ability to train intense sometimes, but you don't have to train intense as much. The zone 2, you do want to keep it up a little bit. One thing I want to point out is that your cardiovascular or your energy systems and your cardiovascular health is one thing. The movement patterns you do is another thing. I remember in my 20s, I was doing a lot of cycling and I was getting quite cardio, quite fit. And then I went for a run. I hadn't been for a run in 2 months, and I struggled and my legs just gave out. because it was a movement pattern that I hadn't done, but I wasn't even puffing. So, when you go for a run, you're not just doing cardio, you're training a movement pattern. If you're running a bit faster, you're training your hip flexors, you're training your hamstrings. I don't like to just box running, riding a bike, and rowing as cardio. They are the unique movement patterns with their own benefits as well. So I like to think of it like that. For some people that, for example, might want to do running, but they're not really capable of going running, there's something called rucking, which you may have heard of. Basically, you can wear like a weighted backpack and go for a walk, and your heart rate will be higher than without the backpack. So if you want to have a slightly elevated heart rate, but you don't want to actually run, if that's not good for your knees, there are ways you can actually increase your heart rate without putting stress on your knees. So that's just one extra thing to think about. Okay, I just want to go over the takeaways real quick that I think I kind of covered, just to cement them a little bit, and then we'll go to the questions. All right, fantastic. So we have a few different energy systems and different fuel sources, and depending on the intensity, these change and they have different downstream effects in our body. And therefore, the adaptations we see are different at different intensities. There isn't a best intensity, which depends on your goals and your physical capabilities. Be mindful of your ability to recover from higher intensities. Remember that cardio is a separate thing from a movement pattern, aka running, cycling, or whatever. And remember that cardiovascular is important for your health in many, many ways, and it should properly be considered in all of your training programs. It's very important. That's it. That's the takeaways. I'll basically open up the floor to questions. Hopefully they're not too hard. I feel like it can get pretty deep, and when I tried researching it deeply, it got pretty confusing pretty quickly. I try to keep it simple because simple is easy to understand. All right, any questions?
Tim, you mentioned mitochondria. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You mentioned mitochondria. Does zone 2 training increase mitochondria?
Yeah. It increases the amount of mitochondria and how well they function, including the uptake of lactate, due to the creation of certain enzymes and transporters responsible for burning lactate as a fuel. There may be other benefits that I'm unaware of with the mitochondria, but that's something that does happen.
I was actually at the gym this morning listening to a podcast by a psychiatrist from the States who's talking about the latest kind of research looking at the link between low levels of mitochondria and poor functioning and mental health problems like depression and anxiety and even things like PTSD. So that's really fascinating, that exercise, because I haven't got through it. Presumably he's going to mention how you correct that, but fascinating that zone 2 training will actually, I guess, another benefit for your mental health, I suppose.
For sure. It's something I didn't even really think of. I have to add it to my slides. Thanks.
I have a question, Tim.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming, so from what you're saying, so zones 3, 4, 5 is typically what we kind of target for gym sessions, with zone 2 typically being, like as you're saying, like more cardio type activities. What's the feedback effects between the two? So how does one, I guess, affect positively or negatively the others? So the 3, 4, 5, how does that affect the 2 and vice versa?
I guess there's many different ways to answer it. I'll start with a specific thing that I remember reading that I thought was interesting. It was to do with high intensity interval training, and it was relevant due to the interval, I think, as well. So these people were kind of saying, people that enjoyed high intensity interval training, they're talking about all the benefits of that. But then they were saying it's good to do zone 2 training due to how it helps with the clearance of lactate, because after you do your intense little bout, you want to get rid of that lactate as quickly as you can so that you can go for like another intense round. So doing zone 2 helps you with kind of like high intensity on and off training, but also like training your VO2 max, as far as I'm aware, should shift your lactate threshold a little bit too. I'm not sure in exact which way. I mean, positively, but I don't know by what sort of mechanism or effect. But I know that improvements in VO2 max usually shifts the ability for you to maintain steady state at a slightly higher intensity. But I can't elaborate on that. It's just what I've seen on a graph, but I can't expand on that. But they're all very important. But also think about it. Like, let's say we do the sleds in the gym, back drag and the prowler. I'm not really programming that for most people for the cardiovascular benefits per se. For me, it's more of the motor patterns and the stabilizers. So it's less for me about the cardiovascular improvements. It's just an extra added benefit. I like that you get a hit, cardiovascular hit as well. But most of the time, I don't program too much cardiovascular stuff in the gym, even if it's something intense. Generally speaking, I'm choosing like muscular adaptations specifically with the benefit of, oh, good, it raised the heart rate up. Anything else? No. Okay.
Can I ask a second question?
Yeah.
Sorry. In zone 2, what's the primary energy source that your body's using? Is it fat or glucose?
Yeah, it'll be a bit different person to person. It will, I don't know if it's exact, like which one's actually the primary. You'll start to utilize more and more glucose and still stay aerobic. I don't know at the very top end of zone 2 whether or not glucose is technically more or not. I don't really know, but I do know that the more time you spend in zone 2, the better you usually get at utilizing fat as an energy source. I can't remember exactly, but when you look at articles of like fat utilization in Tour de France riders, it's through the roof. They try to be very fat adapted. And I'm not sure how they went about that training specifically. That was like way too much deep research that I was referring to. But yeah, but I'm not sure exactly what the balance is in zone 2. But
Right.
yeah, as you move the intensity up, definitely the ratio starts to change. Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember looking into it a while back, and I remember reading somewhere that you do switch to burning more fat in zone 2. But zone 1, I thought you said we're burning fat.
Yeah. Zone 1 should be pretty much fat. And as you increase the intensity, you'll start utilizing more and more glucose. And there becomes a point where basically the fat burning just drops off a cliff and it's just glucose from there on out. There will be crossovers, but lower intensity, as far as I'm aware. Sam can chip in, hopefully. Definitely if I'm wrong, chip in. But I believe like at rest, just above rest, and up into zone 2, it's pretty much fats, and then the ratio changes as the intensity changes. Yeah. Anything else? No. Okay, cool. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining. I hope you got some of these takeaways. Hopefully you'll think about it when you're doing a cardiovascular exercise, what you're trying to get out of it, and maybe think about program considerations or talk to your coach and question them about it as well. All right.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. That was great.
Thanks, Tim.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yeah.